Welcome to the Depth Dive. We've received some really fascinating material from you all,
Definitely.
especially this one document, KI Staatsrechtlichen Systemanalyse. Quite a deep dive into German legal history.
It certainly is. Lots to unpack there.
So our mission today really is to pull out the key ideas for you. We're talking Staatsangehörigkeit, Staatsbürgerschaft, Heimatrechte, the structure of the German state itself.
We want to try and make it clear, maybe offer a few surprises, without getting totally lost in the legal weeds.
Exactly. And what jumps out immediately from this source is this kind of tension, right, between older, more local ideas of belonging and, well, the modern central state.
It raises that question straight away.
Have you ever really stopped to think if being a national is different from being a citizen? Is there more to it?
That's a perfect place to start.
Okay, let's get into it.
So the source makes a really sharp distinction right off the bat between Staatsangehörigkeit and Staatsbürgerschaft. It argues that Staatsangehörigkeit, especially under the old Rustag from 1913, is, well, it's deeper.
Clear how?
Almost like a family connection.
Yeah.
Tied to the historical states, Prussia, Bavaria, places like that. It's rooted in your ancestry.
So it implies an inherited link to the land itself, maybe.
Precisely. Think of it like a birthright.
Yeah.
Connecting you to a specific place and its history. Almost like, inheriting the family farm.
Right, okay. That makes sense. So Staatsangehörigkeit is that deep ancestral regional connection. How is Staatsbürgerschaft different then, according to the source?
Well, Staatsbürgerschaft is presented as something newer, developed over the 20th century.
After those older ties.
Yeah. It's framed more as membership in a central administration, a political affiliation.
Less about the land, more about the organization.
Exactly. It doesn't necessarily carry that same inherent connection to the original territories or those sort of tangible rights.
So following your analogy, Staatsangehörigkeit is inheriting the farm.
And Staatsbürgerschaft is more like joining the National Farming Association. You're in the group, but maybe not with the same direct stake in that specific piece of inherited land.
Okay. So the source isn't just defining words here, it's arguing there's been a shift.
A big one. A shift away from that sort of ancestral belonging towards something more administrative, potentially less rooted.
That really clarifies the distinction they're making. Now, they also bring up something called unmittelbare Reichsangehörigkeit from 1934. What's the significance of that?
Ah, yes. This is where the source gets quite critical.
How so?
The introduction of this direct Reich membership and making it equal to Deutsche Staatsangehörigkeit Staatsbürgerschaft is seen as a deliberate break.
Breaking that link to the original states.
That's the argument. By creating a direct tie only to the Central Reich, it potentially cut people off from, well, having a real say over the ancestral territories they were linked to via the old Staatsangehörigkeit.
So even if you live there, your legal standing changed.
The source suggests it could effectively make someone a kind of foreigner in their own land, at least in terms of influencing that original territory's destiny.
Wow, that's a strong claim.
It is.
So this perspective essentially sees the modern German state, the BRD, and maybe its predecessors after 34 as operating like a sort of foreign administration on land that originally belonged to the older states and the Reich.
That's the essence of the argument presented. That true belonging and the rights that come with it originate from that ancestral Staatsangehörigkeit, not just from a citizenship granted by a central body.
And this idea of deep-rooted belonging, that brings us to Heimatrechte.
Exactly. Heimatrechte. Another fascinating concept the source digs into.
It sounds quite historical, home rights, but it was apparently a big deal until 1934. What were these rights specifically?
They were very real, very practical rights, tied to being part of a specific local community, your Gemeinde.
More than just living there.
Oh, yes. It wasn't just residency. It included the right to reside there, the right to community support, like poor relief if you needed it.
So a safety net tied to your home community.
A safety net, yes.
Yeah.
And also rights to use communal resources. Think shared pastures, forests, that kind of thing. And even political participation at the local level.
So you had a real stake in the community's resources and decisions. What was the legal basis? Where did Heimatrechte come from?
The source points to a few key laws, going way back. The Prussian General Land Law of 1794 laid down the principle that everyone had a Heimatort, a home place responsible for them.
Okay.
Then later, the Reich Freedom of Movement Law of 1867 firmed things up, often linking Heimatrechte to birth or residency.
And the Rustag 1913 we mentioned earlier.
Crucially, yes.
Yeah.
Rustag 1913 directly connected Staatsangehörigkeit to these Heimatrechte.
How did that work?
Well, if you were, say, born in Bavaria and had Bavarian Staatsangehörigkeit, you automatically held Heimatrechte in your local Bavarian community. You were Bavarian top to bottom, with rights at the state and local level.
So the laws built this up over time, linking local belonging with the broader state identity.
Exactly. Solidifying it as a right tied to birth or established connection to a place.
But then the Nazis abolished Heimatrechte in 1934. Why? And what took their place?
Well, the abolition was part of that whole centralization drive under the Third Reich. The 1934 law on the reconstruction of the Reich basically dismantled the sovereignty of the individual states.
And if the states lost power, the basis for state-linked Heimatrechte went too.
Precisely. You remove the foundation. What we have today in the Federal Republic, the BRD, is based on residency. It's governed by the Federal Registration Act, the Bundesmeldegesetz.
So you register where you live and you get certain rights as a resident.
Right, civic rights, yes, but not those specific inherited community rights, not that inherent stake in local common property or the guaranteed local support system in the same way.
It sounds like the old Gemeindezugehörigkeit, that community belonging was much more permanent than just being on a register today.
According to the source, yes. Historically, it was often a status with an inheritance component. You might have claims, potentially, on community land passed down.
Whereas today,
Today, it's primarily a record of where you live. Important for administration, voting, taxes, sure. But without those unique, inherent community entitlements.
the source uses an example, right? Comparing someone from the past to today.
It does. It contrasts a hypothetical Prussian from Königsberg before 1934, who would have had dynastic rights as a Prussian subject, Heimatrechte in their town, and citizen rights with a modern BRD citizen who lacks that kind of layered, deeply rooted set of statuses.
Interesting. And there was another term related to this, Mitberechtigter einer Gebietskörperschaft. What does that add?
Right, Mitberechtigter. It means something like a jointly entitled person of a territorial body.
So more than just belonging, you were entitled to something.
Yes, this concept emphasizes an inheritable, perhaps inalienable membership in that historical community or territory. It wasn't just about living there. It was being part of the collective, a co-owner almost,
Co-owner of what?
of the communal entity itself and its assets, with rights to use communal resources and participate in managing them.
Like the farmer example.
Exactly. The Mecklenburg farmer wasn't just an Angehöriger, a subject of the Duke, but also a Mitberechtigter of their village community. They had a say, a share.
It's almost like being a shareholder in your town, in a way.
That's a loose analogy, maybe, but it captures that idea of having a direct stake and access to communal assets, something largely absent in today's system where public assets are managed by the administration.
This historical perspective really paints a different picture of the individual's place in society. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The source talks about the difference between a natural person and a juristic person. Why is this distinction important here?
This is fundamental legal stuff, but the force argues it has big implications for rights and the state.
Okay.
It starts by distinguishing the actual biological human being, the Mensch, from the legal concept of the natürlicher person.
The natural person in law.
Yes. And the source stresses the natürliche person is how the law represents a human. It's not the human themselves. It even references Roman law persona versus homo to show this isn't a new idea.
So the natural person is like my legal avatar, but not actually me. How does the German Basic Law Article 1 fit in?
Well, Article 1 guarantees the dignity of the Mensch, the human being, the pre-legal person, if you will.
The source of rights.
That's how it's presented, yes. The ultimate source. The natürliche person, on the other hand, defined in the Civil Code, Section 1 BGB, is basically a legal tool.
A tool for what?
For assigning legal relationships. Who can make contracts, own property, be sued, etc. It's the legal system's way of handling humans.
And that's different from juristic persons.
Right. Juristic persons are things like companies, associations, Section 21 BGB. Their rights and duties come entirely from the law. They don't exist biologically.
Okay, so the human Mensch exists first. The law creates the natürlicher person to interact with the human. And juristic persons are pure legal creations.
That's a good summary. You, the living being, are primary. The law needs a way to interface with you, so it uses the natürlich person concept. It doesn't erase you, but it interacts with this legal representation.
And the source concludes what from this?
It concludes the natürlich person, is essentially the legal vehicle for the human who is seen as the originator of law to act within the property law system they created, potentially as a beneficiary without personal liability in that specific legal role.
That's quite a philosophical take on legal status.
It leads directly into what the source calls the paradox of registration and identification.
The Naturek paradox. And what's the paradox?
It's this tension. On one hand, you have the idea, maybe from natural law or thinkers like Rousseau, that the human is sovereign, the source of legitimacy.
We the people.
Right. But on the other hand, Republican systems, as maybe Hegel observed, tend to develop their own logic, their own momentum, becoming self-perpetuating.
So we're supposed to be in charge, but the system takes over. How do ID cards and registration fit into that?
Well, the source contrasts historical examples like the old Germanic thing assemblies where law existed without tons of paperwork with the modern state.
Which needs the paperwork.
And which, the source argues, increasingly treats the individual body as something to be managed. Foucault's biopolitics.
Okay.
So the paradox, or what the source calls juridical hypocrisy, is this. Article 1 of the Basic Law guarantees your inherent dignity as a mensch. But then you have laws like the Federal Registration Act or the ID Card Act, Personalausweisgesetz, that seem to make your ability to function, to exercise rights, dependent on state registration and documentation.
It's like having rights in theory, but needing the state's paperwork to use them in practice.
Exactly. The source gives examples like a homeless person. They have rights, sure, but without an address, an ID, accessing those rights or even basic services becomes incredibly difficult.
Really,
Right?
absolutely.
Or think of indigenous groups who might self-govern without state IDs. It shows other ways are possible.
The source mentions Swiss examples, too.
Briefly, yeah. Historical Swiss voting communities based on oral legitimacy, knowing who belongs without paperwork. Though it does note that's easier in small homogeneous groups, which ties into subsidiarity later.
And now with digital identities, does the source see that making the paradox worse?
It suggests it could, yes. This increasing focus on digital IDs might further sideline the actual physical human being.
So the irony is, the system we created now seems to demand we subordinate ourselves to it through registration.
That's the core of the paradox being presented. The argument is that true inherent sovereignty shouldn't need registration imposed by the state you supposedly created.
Definitely food for thought about basic assumptions. Okay, let's move to the subsidiarity and the idea of a confederal system. What's the source's take here?
It looks back mainly to the German Empire before 1914 as an example of a system with perhaps more genuine subsidiarity.
Before World War I, what defined that system?
The 1871 Reich Constitution is key. Primary sovereignty rested with the 25 member states, Bavaria, Prussia, Saxony, etc.
So power was decentralized.
Significantly. The Central Reich government had limited powers, army, foreign policy, customs, that sort of thing. And crucially, you still had strong local autonomy through Heimatrecht.
And your identity was tied to your state.
Yes. Your primary Staatsangehörigkeit was Bavarian or Saxon or Prussian, linked to your community through descent. There wasn't this idea of a single, centrally managed German people in the same way as today.
But the source talks about a system break around World War I, 1914, 1919. What happened?
The war itself, the use of war laws, enabling acts, these were used, the source argues, to bypass the state parliaments and set up a more centralized administration, essentially under military control, Ludendorff's de facto dictatorship.
Weakening the states drastically.
Fundamentally.
And did Versailles and the Weimar Republic continue this centralizing trend?
According to this analysis, yes. The treaty forced a republicanization. States like Prussia were reduced to administrative units, their sovereignty diminished.
And then came 1934 again.
Right. Replacing the individual state citizenships with that single Reich citizenship. And then the 1935 German Municipal Code further centralized local communities. The source sees the current BRD system as largely continuing this centralized structure.
Okay, so given that critique, does the source propose an alternative, a modern model based on subsidiarity?
It does outline a potential path towards reconstructing what it sees as genuine subsidiarity.
What would that involve?
Several things. First, maybe returning to regional civil registries, bringing back something like the pre-1914 Heimatrecht concept, and getting rid of the Federal Central Register, BZRG.
Decentralizing identity records.
Second, reintroducing member state citizenships. You'd be primarily a Mecklenburger or a Hamburger, again, not just holding the overarching BRD Staatsbürgerschaft, Deutsche Staatsangehörigkeit,
Ah.
as defined in GGR 116.
And the courts.
State courts would become the final instance for most matters. Abolishing the federal constitutional court's supreme role may be similar to how Swiss cantonal law can sometimes trump federal law.
That's a radical restructuring. How could that even happen?
The source suggests it could emerge through a contractual confederation, like the old Confederation of the Rhine or of the 1871 Empire,
Formed by whom?
formed by communities that have, hypothetically, used Article 28.1 of the Basic Law, the part about community self-government, to replace elected councils with direct community assemblies, taking power back locally.
So bottom-up change, creating a new confederation?
That's the vision presented.
Yeah.
It even includes that quote from the historian Heinrich August Winkler.
What does Winkler say?
He said something like, "The modern central state is a product of war. Confederal subsidiarity was not defeated in 1918, but annulled in breach of contract."
Powerful quote. It sums up that perspective.
It does. The source's final argument here is essentially that the pre-war order proved individuals could be legal subjects with rights without needing constant central registration, and that true freedom doesn't necessarily flow down from a central state authority.
Wow. Okay, this has definitely been a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, some really challenging ideas about citizenship, belonging, and the state in Germany.
It really challenges you to think about how these structures evolved and what they mean today.
Absolutely. The core takeaway seems to be this historical friction, this tension between regional, maybe ancestral belonging, and the power of the centralized state.
And how different concepts of rights and identity are tied up in each of those models.
So as we wrap up, here's something to maybe mull over, building on all this. How does the way a state is structured, centralized, or decentralized actually shape how we see ourselves, our identity, and our real connection to the place we live?
And maybe, what does it truly mean to have a voice, a real stake, in the community you call home?
Exactly. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you some new angles to consider on these really fundamental questions. Thanks for joining us.